Muito obrigada, Sofia, muito obrigada a toda a direção da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. Tenho imensa pena, não imagino a pena que eu tenho de não estar presencialmente no Brasil neste momento, mas todos os nossos planos saíram um pouco frustrados. Enfim, melhor encontrarmos assim do que não nos encontrarmos de todo, pelo que todo o esforço que estão a fazer para que o Congresso vá em frente da maneira que é possível, são muito louváveis. Então, agradeço de novo a oportunidade de poder transferir a minha apresentação há uns dias atrás para hoje, porque tive problemas com o teclado do computador e finalmente está resolvido. Então, vou começar a apresentação e vou passar para o inglês também, porque eu tenho a apresentação em inglês e pode ser que haja pessoas que conseguem melhor se eu falar em inglês. Eu imagino que eu posso partilhar a apresentação, não é? Eu vou tentar então. Muito bem, então. So, now I switch to English so that the non-Portuguese speakers can follow my talk, my presentation. So as Sophia has said, I'm not sure if she said that in English or in Portuguese, but I'll repeat it. I have in recent years been working on various dimensions of applied philosophy of language, let's call it. Philosophy of language that is related to hate speech, pejoratives, various dimensions of evaluative discourse. And so the talk today that I'm going to give is on the expression of hate in hate speech. Let me start the timer. There we go. The idea that hate speech is expressive of hate is it's a kind of controversial idea. And some people, mostly people in jurisprudence and in legal theory, don't think that it's a viable idea, that you can define hate speech as expressive of hate. And I think that this is because theorists outside of philosophy of language or outside of the philosophy of emotions or outside of psychology tend to have a slightly narrow conception of what expression of a sentiment or emotion is on the one hand, and on how emotions can be shared collectively. Okay, so let me see if this, exactly, oh God, I have to go back. Okay, so some of the questions that are typically taken to be part of this debate are questions of the following kind. Does hate speech express hate, or an emotion of hate, or a sentiment of hate? What is hate speech? How should we define hate speech? Must the speaker who makes an utterance that we can count as hate speech feel hate when he or she makes that utterance? So these are some of the questions that people try to answer in the literature. So what I'll try to do is the following. I want to offer an account of how hate speech can express hate. And this account, in fact, expands on joint work with Manuel Garcia Carpintero. It's on a paper that was published earlier this year. And in that paper, we offer what we call an expressive normative account of derogatory language, or of pejoratives and slurs. And I think that we can expand this to the case of hate speech more broadly. To do this, we can combine an account of what we call an illocutionary structure of conversational contexts, normative requirements that different kinds of speech acts make on conversational contexts. And we can combine this with recent accounts of attitudes or sentiments that are expressed through hate speech. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I don't do cognitive science of emotions or philosophy of emotions, but there's a lot of work that I think that we in philosophy of language can adopt and make use of to advance our theories. And so this is what I want to do. And in the end, I want to give a tentative reason as to why hate speech is morally wrong, right? And why we should avoid engaging in it, in things that count as hate speech. Okay, so main claims I want to make. A given kind of speech, I want to say, is going to be hate speech just in case it is systematically expressive of hatred. And one way one can explain what systematic expression of hatred is to say that such speech has systematic effects, which are generally illocutionary. They have to do with a kind of illocutionary force or speech act, kind of speech act that is being done. Okay. Now, what do we mean by systematicity? In a related but not the same debate on what silencing speech is, it's not hate speech, it's a different kind of phenomenon. Ishani Maitra, here portrayed, she says in a paper of hers from 2004 that to say that silencing systematically disadvantages women, for instance, might be to say that the social context in which we live is such that there are, in effect, a number of context-specific rules that particularly interfere with women's abilities to make themselves understood. Right. Later, in another paper of hers, she explicitly considers the possibility of a kind of silencing, which would be what some authors like Ray Langton or Jennifer Hornsby have called illocutionary disablement. People are disabled from performing certain kinds of speech acts. And this will be a way of being silenced. So she considers that a kind of illocutionary disablement would be that it is systematic, is to say at least that it occurs in a wide range of contexts and that it's hard to overcome or escape when it does occur. Okay. So this gives us an idea of what kind of systematicity we're looking at or we're looking for. Now, Jeremy Waldron is an author that works mostly on questions about free speech in the law and on notions of hate speech and how to define hate speech and why hate speech is harmful in the American context. And he thinks that the American legal system is too permissive of hate speech, and that part of a recent book of his called The Harm in Hate Speech tries to make this case and argue that hate speech is harmful in a way that would warrant more strict restrictions in the law. Now, to define what hate speech is, which is a notion that is offering as speech that has as an aim or as a goal to attack a person's assurance of dignity in society. This is what it takes a hate speech to be or to do. He has to give a definition of what it takes to be the assurance of dignity, which is, I'll read in the next paragraph. So he says, each person, each member of each group should be able to go about his or her business with the assurance that there will be no need to face hostility, violence, discrimination, or exclusion from others. And this is what he calls the basic social standing, or their dignity. Okay, so I want to agree with Waldron that hate speech does this. It attacks the targets of hate speech are targeted in their dignity as human beings or in their basic social standing. So I want to agree on this. Now, according to Waldron, then hate speech has an aim, which is to send a message to its targets that they cannot be assured that their basic dignity is protected. And that they may face hostility, violence, discrimination, or exclusion from others. And he thinks that this is, there's someone talking. Right?
Yes, I am. Teresa, I just want to be certain that you aren't changing your slides. Is that right?
No. My slide, I'm on slide 7.
No, we can't see it.
Oh my God, and what about now?
Now, yes, but okay. now it's changing to slide 1, I think, or we didn't.
No, it's on 7.
Now it's 7, but we didn't see the
we
other
didn't
one.
see this one.
Yes, yes.
I can show you if you want to have a look. Okay. So the more important things that you've missed so far, let me see. This is important. So the main claims I wanted to make, as I said, were that this is strange. So when I make my screen large, it doesn't share the movement of the slides. That's a problem. Okay, so I'll keep it like this.
It happens. Yeah.
I'm sorry. So this was the two main claims, as I was just saying before. One of them is that speech is hate speech just in case it's systematically expressive of hatred, and that these effects are in general illocutionary effects. So this was one of the main slides that I was showing. The points on Ishani Maitra on systematicity and how not about hate speech, but about silencing. So Ishani Maitra tries to make sense of the idea of silencing as something that has to systematically disadvantage or disable someone from either making a speech hack or to be understood or to just speak, right? It can't just be that occasionally we shut someone up, that a person who is eventually episodically silenced, someone that we manage to shut up occasionally or temporarily in a non-systematic way does not have a claim to being silenced. And so I want to use this idea that there's a difference between episodic, local event, let's say, and the systematic occurrence of an event, right? Okay, and this was Waldron on the notion of an assurance of dignity and how what hate speech does is target this idea of assurance of dignity, which I'll read again. He says each person, each member of each group should be able to go about his or her business with the assurance that there will be no need to face hostility, violence, discrimination, or exclusion from others. And this is what he calls people's dignity or their social standing. Okay, and this is where we were when Sophia thankfully noticed that you weren't seeing the slides. So, because I'm reading this again, I will repeat that Waldron thinks that what is characteristic of hate speech is not that it is not expressive of the speaker's hate towards someone. He wants to characterize it instead in terms of the aims or the targets of the kind of hostility, violence, or discrimination that a person will feel that they're not from, right? There are also, I'll also remark that there are two green lines, looks like someone has drawn here on the screen. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know what the source or cause of that is. Anyway, so I'll move on. So this is Waldron's idea. And unlike Waldron, I think it's because hate speech is expressive of hate that it communicates that its target's basic dignity is not assured. And so I'll try to make a case for this. I'll have the time for all of it. So let's put together the idea that some speech does something systematically or has some kind of systematic effects, together with the idea that hate speech undermines a target's dignity or social standing. Okay. So if we put together the two things, we should have a necessary condition for hate speech. Hate speech systematically would aim to undermine a target's social dignity, and it seeks to undermine the target's assurance of protection from hostility, violence, discrimination, or exclusion from others. That's what it would mean to target in a systematic way the target social dignity. Now, there are some goods that we get from the requirement that hate speech must be systematic. One is to rule out what I think is some of the concerns that is other people in the law, for instance, or in jurisprudence worry about, including too many things as hate speech. So I think that if we include the notion of systematicity, it allows us to rule out some verbal expressions of hate from the category of hate speech. Here's an example. So a case ruled out. If you have an utterance that expresses an episodic hate emotion, that utterance doesn't count it as hate speech because it does not meet a systematic condition. It doesn't occur systematically in language use. So for instance, imagine that we have a group of children playing, and one of the children, one of them is always wants to play longer than the others, or the others get bored more easily and want to play something else. And so you can imagine one child shouting to another or to the other children, "I hate you." Okay, so this should not count as hate speech, even if the child at the moment has a very strong feeling that it's completely unfair that his friends don't want to play with him anymore. Okay, completely unfair, and his friends are so mean. So, to understand how we can go further in excluding this occasional episodic hate emotions from the relevant kind of feeling or cognitive state that is involved in hate speech, we should look a bit more at people who work on the emotions of hate. So I rely a lot on Fisher et al., a paper that does a review of recent work on hate and related emotions. So they say that hate is developed when others mistreat or humiliate someone, or whose deliberate actions have become an obstruction to someone's goals. When individuals experience hate, they typically perceive their hate target as having malicious intentions, being immoral, which is accompanied by feelings of lack of control or powerlessness. Such appraisals are not the result of one specific action, but of a belief about the stable disposition of the hated person or group. And then they make this important distinction. So they distinguish between an episodic emotion, for instance, what the child feels towards some of his friends who don't want to continue to play with him every single day when he wants to go on. So it might be an episodic emotion that is directed towards someone who is perceived to be malicious or who obstructs his goals. But more importantly for their goals, and also for the goals I want to achieve by focusing on what hate speech is, hate can evolve into a long-term sentiment. And particularly in intergroup contexts, in contexts in which we have social dynamics of group relationships between in-groups and out-groups, or us versus them. So this allows us to say, or to explain a bit more, why episodic non-systematic expressions of hate are not hate speech. First, someone who feels hate as an episodic emotion can be hostile or threaten violence against someone else whose social standing or whose dignity is in no way threatened. So someone who has a high social position, for instance. And that is not hate speech, even if there is any hostility or any violent threat that should be monitored in any case. Right? So someone might feel hate as an episodic emotion against someone who crashed against my car, for instance, right? Or who never cares about scratching my car when they park their own car, for instance. And this person's social standing is in no way threatened. So that is not saying that, oh, this neighbor, that's in no way hate speech. It's just, I'm really annoyed at my neighbor. Now, a slightly more complicated case, but I also think that it doesn't count as hate speech, and I think that there's a lot of confusion often in public debates around this. It might be that someone can feel hate as an episodic emotion directed towards someone whose dignity is not assured socially, because perhaps this person who's the target or who's the object of this emotion might, say, be of a lower social class, or maybe of a specific ethnic group, for instance. But if this hate emotion is motivated, for instance, because that person is, say, someone feels hate temporarily towards someone else because they found out that that person is having an affair with their partner. And so because they're jealous, or because they're really upset, and because of whatever reasons, the reason for the hate is completely personal and has nothing to do with the social group or the social standing of the person. And so I think that in that case, it should also not count. It does not count as hate as an episodic emotion either. Okay. However, there might be an objection here. Okay, no, it's not obeying. Now it's obeying. So here's a question. In fact, this is a question that was raised to me by Laura Caponetto recently at the ECAP conference in that was supposed to have been in the Netherlands, but I still got the question. She asked me, does it mean that a slur featuring utterance of to derogate someone that the speaker temporarily hates for personal reasons, does that mean that that is not hate speech? And then she went on to say, well, that might seem controversial, given how paradigmatic of hate speech slur featuring utterances have been taken to be in the literature. Right, so my response here is that we are mixing, it's an interesting case, but I don't think this is a problem for my view. Slurs, I think, are constitutively expressive of contempt or of some other related emotion in the range of anger, disgust, contempt, hate, or some kind of antipathy. Okay. And otherwise, they would not count as slurs. And I will say a bit more soon about what my view of slurs is, and then how this would apply. This applies to hate speech. And I think that their expressive meaning encodes that systematicity, the fact that they are indeed expressive of a given type of emotion, even if or sentiment, I'm sorry, even if what the speaker feels is not the relevant hate sentiment against the target. Okay. So even if the person feels hatred for a reason that is in no way related to the slur or the meaning of the slur or the expressive meaning of the slur, it would still follow that a particular utterance with a very bad slur might still count as hate speech. Okay. So that's my reply to this potential objection. So the hate sentiment is what I said was the relevant feeling or sentiment, let's say cognitive state, that we should focus our attention on. And in particular, it's particularly relevant in the way that it evolves in social contexts and in collective actions and in group action. And it is very important in the social organization of out-groups and in-groups or us versus them dynamics. So if this is so, it would not be episodic hate emotions, but long-lasting hate sentiments that create systematic conditions for hate speech to exist. So to recall, systematic speech effects will occur in wide ranges of contexts and will be hard to overcome or escape when they occur. And so we want it to be the case that when there is this hate sentiment, it will also be sufficiently long-lasting to be able to be part of this systematic speech effects. In a slightly older paper, Halperin et al. Say that the hate sentiment in intergroup contexts is a stable and familiar hating emotional attitude, what they call chronic hatred, or some authors call chronic hatred, which organizes people's social world and helps strengthen the connection to the in-group through something like in-group love at the expense of various out-groups through out-group hate. So the goal of the hate sentiment is to eliminate the out-group from the environment of in-group, for example, through an absolute separation from members of the other group, but it could be in stronger or slightly weaker forms. It could be through introducing an hierarchy where the out-group is kept in a lower social position, or it can be, as in various kinds of genocide, by mass killing the targets of the hate sentiment. So, illocutionary effects. For systematic effects of hate speech to relate expressively to speech, it doesn't suffice that hate as a sentiment occurs systematically in society, because there will be no connection between the fact that certain kinds of people tend to be hated by other types of people. It must also be that there's some aspect of the meaning or of the illocutionary force of language that is expressive of the hate sentiments against specific groups, and that the expressed sentiments can update what's common ground, i.e. what's taken for granted in society or among an in-group. So what I will do next is to offer an account of expressive speech that tries to meet this challenge. So before we do this, let's just recall the three broad kinds of illocutionary forces. So we might have speech acts that are assertives, and assertives can be characterized as speech acts that add propositions that are taken for granted as common ground in the standard Stalnackerian sense. So they can be accepted cognitively or believed, or as good as believed and taken for granted, or as common knowledge for given purposes of conversations. But there are other kinds of speech acts. And recently, many people have been working on directives and interrogatives and how they alter common ground in conversational contexts. So speech acts that are in the broad range of directives, it might include promises, orders, requests, etc. They add plans to the common ground if they're accepted in the relevant way. And interrogatives, they add questions that are in discussion. That's what the QUD means. So questions under discussion are the ones that basically guide our inquiry, the things that, and they help us narrow down what the relevant possible worlds, let's say, that are part of common ground are in a given conversation. But we have additional types of speech acts that are expressives. In fact, David Kaplan has offered for some expressions theories of meaning that are not truth conditional, but that are use conditional. So they'll explain, he explains that for certain expressions, the conditions of use of the expressions will express a certain kind of emotion or attitude or feeling, etc. Okay, so we can also consider that some speech acts are expressives. Okay, so if we allow for different kinds of speech acts to alter what our conversational record is and what we take for granted when we communicate with each other, and what is part of what we know broadly speaking and what we accept broadly speaking, we should say that in felicitous cases in which a given act of speech is accepted and gets to update context, different normative commitments that are related to the different illocutionary forces of these speech acts, they will be mutually shared and license different kinds of presuppositions, which in turn will motivate shared actions, right? The things that we know, what time a certain bus runs, who is running for an election, what should be done to prevent the spread of a certain disease, etc. Okay, so all these things license presuppositions that get to be shared, and they in turn allow for particular kinds of actions to ensue. Okay, so now we have, I think, a little bit of what's required to introduce what our view in the paper, joint paper that I mentioned just earlier with Manuel Garcia Carpintero, where we offer what we call an expressive presuppositional account of derogatory language. So now, why should we want to focus on a kind of presuppositional story? There are basically two ideas for this. So remember that Ishani Maitra said that there are some speech effects that occur in a wide range of contexts, and now it's the important bit, and are hard to overcome or escape. This being hard to overcome or escape seems to be characteristic of not at issue content, i.e. content that is presupposed but not mentioned. And this is also features that slurs and pejoratives tend to have. Some people say that the expressive meaning of the pejoratives, the fact that they are offensive, that they seem to have a load that is effective in a way that is not, you're not just merely describing someone else, and that expressive meaning seems to project in various situations in which the words are embedded. Say, when we ask a question, is that so-and-so coming for dinner, using a slur? Oh, no, the so-and-so is not coming for dinner. You're still supposing that the person is so-and-so, etc. Right? So this seems to project, and so some people think that there's enough evidence to say that this derogatory content that is expressive is somehow communicated as a presupposition. And many authors have argued for this. So for instance, Josep Macià, Philip Schlenker, Bianca Cepolaro, and Isidora Stojanovic, for instance, have all offered expressive presuppositional accounts. So in this recent paper of ours, we agree, but only if the expressive presuppositions are not just propositions. We are not just adding what Manolo has called flat propositions, i.e. propositions without any illocutionary force, that get to be believed. And most theories tend to do this, tend to flatten the presuppositions in a way that loses the emotional dimension, right? And we think that this doesn't work for expressive force of slurs and pejoratives or for the expression of hate sentiments. And I'll explain with an illustration from an example by Philip Schlenker. So, for instance, Philip Schlenker focuses on the meaning of this slur, honky, which is a slur for poor white people in the south of the United States. There's like redneck is another slur for poor white people, working class people in the US. So what Schlenker says is that when we use honky to say, for instance, that person is watching Eurovision, using the word honky, we're saying that the demonstrated person or the person we're talking about is doing something, watching Eurovision, for instance, and at the same time, we are presupposing something else. And what he thinks we're presupposing is that the following: the agent of the context believes in the world of the context that white people are despicable, that poor white people are despicable, i.e. that the speaker thinks that poor white people are despicable. So this is a clear-cut condition on a Stalnackerian context. But it doesn't capture derogatory content, as Timothy Williamson has argued, for instance, and others also. I'll explain why now. So suppose we are a non-bigoted audience. We're not bigoted. And we refuse to accept, to go along with a speaker's utterance of the sentence too. That honky is watching Eurovision tonight. So what is it that we're communicating, that the speaker was communicating with the sentence? It could be that the literal content, the truth conditions, or the at issue content is that the demonstrated white person is watching Eurovision. But this we can accept because it's true, and we've just learned something about the world in accepting this. We could wonder, is it that the not at issue content, i.e. the presupposition that is being communicated, is that the speaker believes that white people are despicable? Well, we can also accept that because we just learned, because the speaker used a slur for white people, we have just learned that the speaker thinks that it's okay to treat white people with contempt as despicable people. So we can also accept that is true. However, we still don't want to go along with the utterance into. So the question is, in the theory is, what is it that we don't accept? And if there's something that we don't accept, it is something that Schlenker's account has failed to capture. So what the previous slide shows is that we can't represent what is common ground, what would be common ground if we had accepted that utterance, merely in terms of a flat proposition. It's just a proposition that the speaker accepts that a certain action is permissible, namely treating certain people with contempt. Because this is something that we have, in fact, added to common ground. Now, Josep Macià, who's a colleague of mine here, has a different view. He says that the presupposition is different, that it is the presupposition that goes with honky is something the speakers of the context, i.e. all of us, the interlocutors, are disposed to treat white people with a certain kind of contempt because they are white. Now, if we are not bigoted, we don't have this disposition, and so the presupposition is false. And so that would explain why we're not willing to accept the utterance of two. And Macià, in fact, invites us to compare that false presupposition with another false presupposition. For instance, one that goes with the use of a pronoun she. So we could say that the presupposition that goes with the use of a pronoun in an utterance using the pronoun she would be when one accepts the utterance, one accepts that the referent of the demonstrative pronoun is female. So if someone says, well, she's not coming on the bike ride tomorrow, we have learned that the demonstrated person is not coming on the bike ride, and we have also learned that that if we accept it, we have accepted that the demonstrated person is female. And it may be false that the demonstrated person is female, and if it is, we may resist accepting three. This is Macià's explanation, and I think it still fails. And I will now, in the next slide, try to explain why I think it still fails. So what is it that a slur, a pejorative, a piece of derogatory language requires that we accept, that we go along with, that we let pass. So let's compare it. To accept that the referent of the pronoun she is female is to accept all that there is to accept in the utterance of three, beyond accepting that the person is not coming on the bike ride. But to accept the use of a slur is not merely a matter of accepting that we are disposed to treat the target of the slur with contempt. I can accept this proposition as true for current purposes, which is what accepting a Stallman-Carrier proposition would be, and still not do what the use of the slur normatively requires, namely to condone treating the target of the slur with contempt. So suppose that we accept that suppose that we accept that we are all disposed to treat certain people with contempt because, say, we have become convinced that there is structural and institutional racism, that people have implicit biases, and so I think that we are all racist, for instance. Even if I accept that, I have accepted now what the presupposition was, but I still nonetheless refuse to endorse treating people with racist animosity and with contempt, because I don't want to be a racist. I think it's wrong and we shouldn't do it, right? And in fact, many people who are anti-racist seem to believe something of this kind, that everybody is racist to some extent, but we shouldn't do it, and so they refuse endorsing treating other people with contempt. And so what this means is that Macias's explanation of what the presupposition that is communicated is not good enough. It's still a flat proposition that doesn't explain what it is that we don't accept when we don't accept the use of a slur. So what is our view? Our view is a little bit complicated, and I'll try not to, let me see how I'm doing with time. Right, I have 10 minutes. So I think I'm going to read just the first bullet point of this slide, and then I'm going to go to the next, because I want to get to the good bits at the end. I don't want to leave too much here. So in our view, our expressive presuppositional view is different because we try to incorporate a different account of how the emotions that are expressed work, and about how the contents of particular illocutionary contents are used to update context. So some philosophers have argued that emotions are just a particular kind of judgment to the effect that an object or situation instantiates a certain formal object. I am not going to read this bit. If anyone wants me to send the slides or the paper from which where we develop this view, please get in touch with me and I'll send you. I'll move to the next slide because I don't want to take too much time here. So a view of emotion, alternative views of emotions that exist nowadays. Some of them treat emotions as particular kinds of normative states. You have people like Kevin Mulligan, Dimes and Jacobson, and Dion Antironi having a discussion about what emotions themselves are. And so emotions here have formal objects that are normative, say, being worthy of contempt. And these formal objects are not part of what is represented as part of a belief state. For instance, they are normative conditions that appraise the emotional attitude given its content. So they make whether someone is or not worthy of contempt makes the emotion of contempt towards that person fit or apt or not. Okay. So if we assume some view of emotions along these lines and put it together with some view of expressive speech acts, what do we get? So we could have speech acts that express emotions that are in turn defined by related constitutive norms. A presuppositional view of pejoratives would add further illocutionary structure to contexts, and the intentional objects of emotional states are the contents of this additional structure. So to make an example, because this might be complicated. So in the case of honky, for instance, poor white people, when we use like honky, are featured as instantiating a certain condition, like generically having such and such traits, not being educated, I don't know what else, okay? This condition is taken to make contempt or derogation the fitting emotional reactive attitude towards those people. Such people hence become regarded as adequate recipients of mistreatment. Okay? So negative reactive attitudes like resentment or contempt guide our behavior towards other people. They are ways of putting down, of punishing, or presenting another person as deserving a particular kind of treatment. So pejoratives and slurs, on our view, are expressive of emotions that present their targets as worthy of derogation, of putting the target group of persons down and exclude them. And in fact, this guarantees that the targets cannot be assured that their basic dignity is protected, which was what Jeremy Waldron wanted to ensure. That's what hate speech does, to attack someone's basic dignity or social standing. So this seems to be exactly what derogatory language does on our view. So how does this generalize to the spread of hate through hate speech, which is a topic that half the world, if not the whole world, seems to be interested nowadays? It seems that we can't represent hate sentiments that become common ground in terms of a speaker accepting the proposition that her interlocutor hates persons of a certain group, because we've just realized that there are people who do accept that presupposition. But we can account for how the expression of hate through hate speech contributes to the spread of hate sentiments, if we take into account the rich variety of semantic, pragmatic, and then the account of emotions that is now available from different kinds of theories. So maybe the process of the spread of hate sentiments involves generally what Amica Salmela and Nagatsu describe in the following way about when they talk about collective emotion sharing. They say, we suggest that these collective emotions emerge when a group of individuals appraise the emotion eliciting event convergently in relation to their overlapping private concerns. And such mechanisms as attentional deployment, emotional contagion, facial and motor mimicry, and behavioral entrainment synchronize the individual's emotional responses, producing a shared affective experience among individuals who are mutually aware that others are feeling the same. So, what I will see soon next features of derogatory and hate speech are on our theory, and I can already sell you the virtues of the expressive presuppositional account as we defend. So the expressive presuppositional account explains better than alternatives 3 features of such expressions that involving slurs and hate. There's an effective dimension associated with the use of a pejorative or of hateful speech. And that effective dimension normally projects. It projects under modal embedding in questions and under directives, for instance. The conveyed derogatory hateful content doesn't just add descriptive information to the context. We saw that with the discussion of Schlenker and Massian, that we're not just adding new propositions to the context. By itself, the falsity of the assumed basis for derogation or hate doesn't explain why it's morally wrong. This is a further feature. So, in the beginning, I had ruled out some cases where hate is expressive, but that should not count as hate speech. And now I want to say that there are cases in which that should be ruled in as hate speech. So some discourse can be hate speech because it has a particular kind of expressive illocutionary force that is expressive of a certain kind of hate sentiments. And there is a systematic prevalence of hate sentiments against a particular target outgroup in a wide range of contexts which are hard to overcome or escape. So these are indications that a certain kind of speech is going to be hate speech, even if the speaker, as I was saying earlier on, might not feel hate as an emotion on a particular episode, during a particular episode. As Maitra said about silencing women, which is an interesting case that we might think is also an example of hatred of women, she said there are in effect a number of context-specific rules that particularly interfere with women's abilities to make themselves understood. And this can be extrapolated to the hatred of women. Okay, I'll give you some examples now. So let me explain what this is. So a scold was a pejorative or derogatory term for women You could also, in English, there was also the shrew. There's, in fact, a Shakespeare play called The Taming of the Shrew that says it all. We're taming a certain kind of woman. And the scold is as, so let's read first what comes with the image on the top right. A scold is paraded through the community wearing the bridle. The bridle is an iron contraption used to punish women with a sharp tongue. So women who have a mind of their own, who speak their mind, they'll be punished. This is, I think, from the 16th century by wearing a bridle. Significantly, a similar device was used by European slave traders in Africa to subdue their captives and carry them to their ships. And below you have a description of how the bridle would work. There will be a spiked curved plate that presses down on top of the tongue to silence nagging women or witches. If thy tongue lying calmly in place, it inflicts a minimum of pain, so she should be able to put up with it. A chain can also be used to yank the victim through the streets. There were laws against scolds in England and Wales until, I think, 1967. And the picture on the left is from a woman in Ireland at some point in the 20th century. I'm not sure the year. So it's very recent that women were literally silenced. And we can only think that the women in question, well, women who speak their minds, are literally silenced until so recently, because there is in fact a lot of misogyny. So the silencing of women and misogyny are not independent effects. So I was saying that the expression of hate has some illocutionary effects on what we take for granted, what we assume is common ground in various kinds of conversational contexts. And so what are these normative requirements or normative effects that hate speech has? Well, I think that we can look at what authors like Fisher et al. Have presented as characteristics of hate sentiments, and we can assume that those characteristics are the normative requirements that will change and have an effect on context. In the first place, we have negative appraisals of the outgroup members as malevolent, malicious, just by being members of the group. We have action tendencies that go from revenge, social exclusion, or attacks, even to the destruction of the target group. And we have motivational goals, such as the desire to harm, to humiliate, or even to kill the target. So it seems that current research on hate fits well with views on emotions as perception-like non-conceptual states with evaluative content, or of reactive attitudes as sui generis normative states of appraisals. And the formal object of the emotion, the property of being hateful, would not be part of the propositional content of hate speech, but of the normative condition that appraises the emotional attitude. So if we write schematically what the normative condition that appraises the aptness or fittingness of a hate sentiment, we could write something of the following kind. One must hate a group, G, on account of their having stable negative features, only if members of the group have those features, and hatred of people with those features is fitting, right? The hatred of G fits any group with such features. So this will make hate into a very peculiar sentiment. It seems that it can be fit as an emotion, but I would like to say it's still morally unjustified and still morally wrong. So this is one of the things I want to say before we finish. And oh my God, I'm slightly over time, but I'm almost done. I hope it's okay. So here's a question that Dan Zeman also asked me in another context. In fact, I used to raise these kind of questions to people all the time, and now I've thought about it a bit more. So let's think, for instance, about the term Nazi, right? Nazi is used often as a derogatory term against, well, members of the National Socialist Party, right? So assume that Nazi was used as a slur for members of the National Socialist Party in Germany before and during World War II. Its use seems to conform to the normative requirements of hate speech that I am proposing here. There are negative appraisals of the members of the party as malevolent, malicious, just by being members of the group. There are certain action tendencies that go from revenge, social exclusion, attacks, or destruction of the target group. Well, there was a war. There are also motivation goals, such as a desire to harm, humiliate, or even kill the target. So it looks that using Nazis systematically and with it fulfilling these requirements would count as hate speech, as I am defining it. And so Dan Zeman asked me, well, would it be justified or is it morally permissible? Well, one direct answer would be that it's indeed hate speech and that some examples of hate speech are justified or even morally permissible. I want to say that he's wrong about this for the following examples. If Dan Zeman were right that some instances of hate speech are morally permissible, then these examples of actions against the Germans would have been morally permissible and legitimate, but they are not. And in fact, they're a shame for the people who defeated the Germans. So one of them, for instance, is the bombings of Dresden in 1945. There was a recent article in the, I think it was the BBC, I think, covering what happened. For instance, in the bombing of Dresden, British aircraft launched an attack on the eastern German city of Dresden. In the days that followed, they and their US allies dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs in the assault. The ensuing firestorm killed 25,000 people, mostly civilians, ravaging the city center, sucking the oxygen from the air and suffocating people trying to escape the flames. There was no military target involved. It was just the destruction of buildings and churches and civilian life. Another example was when the Red Army, so the Soviet forces arrived in Germany for the first 2 years, from 45 to 47, 1947, when they finally left. There was a large incident of mass rape by the Red Army soldiers of German women of all ages, from children to old ladies. There's an estimated 2 million German women were raped by the Soviet Red Army soldiers, as written by Walter Zappel, I can't say his name, in his book Beyond Duty, The Reason Some Soldiers Commit Atrocities. This is not righteous or morally permissible. I'm not going to read more because this might be a trigger warning. I should have made a trigger warning before I gave this example. So the account I offer is consistent with recent research on how hate speech spreads from the individual to the collective level and is shared by in-group members, and is consistent with research suggesting that increase in hate speech correlates with increase in hate crimes against members of target groups. I wanted to ask Sophia what she thinks, because I'm 5 minutes over time. So I could stop here if you think that's okay, or I could just finish. I'm nearly done. I mean, it's up to Sophia.
You need more 5 minutes? It's okay if you need. I would say, yeah.
I'm almost done, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, it's
5
2 more
minutes,
slides.
I think it's okay.
Okay, I'll be done soon. So this is a more recent example. This is a recent example that involves the discussion and debate about, it started as a targeting of a particular kind of radical feminists. I don't know the origins of the term. Some people say that the word TERF was started as a word by radical feminists, that they say that feminism is a movement for the liberation of women and should center females, and so it should not include trans people, in particular trans women. They have nothing against including trans men because they are also females. But the word has evolved, and it has evolved in particular into a slur against anyone of a certain kind. So that many people who are called TERFs are not feminists to begin with, or they're not radical feminists, have never heard of anything, that just ask questions or whatever. So it seems that Twitter Term Reviews has acknowledged that TERF is a misogynistic slur. There was the UK District Judge, John Woolard, agreed. He says that he agreed in this case. Then in the UK, an all-party parliamentary group on hate crime reports on the rise of hate crime. And they recognize that TERF is used as a term of abuse with violent threats. And they have registered that there was a bomb threat against a meeting of Women's Place in the UK. There was an attack on a 60-year-old woman, etc. And they say in the report that it can easily be argued that this constitutes hate speech under the Criminal Justice Act, which people have been successfully prosecuted for. What I leave here is a few examples from a ceremonial hanging of the TERF, people saying kill TERFs, I punch TERFs, Germaine Greer, a famous feminist, saying she's anti-immortal, here's to her death, so it's basically a death threat, etc. So this incredibly misogynistic speech targeting women. So this seems, again, to fulfill the normative requirements of this speech, that this is making on common ground, and this is provided by characteristics of hate sentiments, namely negative appraisals, as I've said before, action tendencies, motivational goals, such as a desire to harm, humiliate, or even kill the targets. After Waldron, these are all harmful because they undermine the target's assurance of dignity. And this, as the bombing of Dresden or the rape of German women by the Red Army soldiers, is morally wrong in any case. And now I'm done. Thank you very much, Sophia. If you want, I can stop sharing the screen, or I can leave it up if people have specific questions. It's up to you.
Thank you very much. Very nice, very interesting, and also challenging in a, not only in a theoretical way, also in a pragmatical way. So, but or in a very personal way, maybe also. But so we have now time for questions. We have already Filippo Contesi who wants to make a question.
Right, so it's a bit difficult because I have 3 big questions. So I guess I'll just ask one, and then maybe we can talk later, or if there's time, I can, yeah. So I guess my well, I'll ask you the super technical, easy easy to ask question. So the slides between 10 and 11, right, where you talk about the characteristics of hate, and you say that in 10 you define hate as appropriate towards someone. I'm trying, you know, if I'm wrong, you tell me that, so I'm trying to remember. It's appropriate towards people you perceive to be morally wrong or something like that, right? So, and then in slide 11, you say that so because of that definition, then hate speech towards like the kids who's being bullied, saying I hate you, in that case that's not hate speech because the bully is not the bully's social standing is not threatened in any way, and so that can be so that can involve hate. And I was just wondering why you passed from the perceive to be in a higher social position or doing something morally wrong or whatever you, to their social standing is not threatened, right? So what if I just perceive, say I'm the kid who's being bullied? Well, I mean, that's not hard to imagine. But so I and I perceive that the bully that I can, you know, I don't know, that I can threaten his social standing or something like that, right? Why is that not? So, you know, hate seems to be something, I mean, it's all emotions. That seems to be something to do with perception or imagination, right? It doesn't have to be true that something is disgusting in order for you to be disgusted by it or something like that, right? So you don't. So if a dog is a small dog and you're afraid of the dog, right? You're still afraid of the dog, even if objectively the dog is not, or if it's not dangerous, right? Or if you're imagining a dog, you're reading a novel, you're imagining there's a dangerous dog, and you feel afraid, you still feel afraid, even if the dog is not existent.
I think so. So my point has to do with for it to be, it's not that there isn't hate. The kid might feel hate anyway. The point is that unless it is systematic in a relevant way and it evolves into a hate sentiment, then it doesn't. So first it has to evolve into a hate sentiment, and then it has to become systematically tied to the expression of that hate sentiment. And the situation with the kids playing, even if the kid has a very strong emotion and has a perception that the others wronged them terribly, that might be hate for all we know, even if it's unjustified, but it's not hate speech because it's still not systematic, as it's not systematic tied to any particular type of speech that might target a particular individual through his whole life, because this is something that I didn't say, but I could have said that I want to admit that there might be a target of specific people as, say, scapegoats, or that some people might be the targets of hate as a hate sentiment for a long time, like, I don't know, Hillary Clinton for most of her professional career in politics. But I don't want to, but typically it involves intergroup relations. And so you have the evolution into a hate sentiment from the hate emotion into the hate sentiment, and you have a systematic expression of that through speech. And with the kids' case, language hasn't changed. You have not created a new form of expression in language, or new signs, or new caricatures, or new types of language use that are used systematically to insult, threaten, or target specific, or derogate specific kinds of people. Right? And so with the child case, that it's not all, in the beginning, we should not count as hate speech. I mean, I don't think that's even if you have the emotion.
Thank you, Teresa. And we have a question from Miroslav, I think. Miroslav?
Yes. Thank you, Teresa.
Hi.
Hi. I noticed that you talk about illocutionary effects a lot, but not about perlocution. So I suspect that you're trying to give us a richer account of what illocution is, including certain effects, but that is distinct from what Austin meant by perlocution. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question. I just.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. No. There was going to be no time. I wanted to have a third part of the paper or the talk where I would go into how my view distinguishes from, say, Mary Kate McGowan's on oppressive speech, and how I think that, in fact, in many aspects of her view, and also in Waldron's explanation of what hate speech is, if they seem to want to give a constitutive account of what hate speech is, but I think that they are just characterizing various kinds of perlocutionary effects, right? How it threatens, how it undermines someone's assurance, all those things are perlocutionary effects. And if we talk in terms of what the normative requirements that a particular kind of speech is making on context, that is what characterizes that particular kind of speech. Right? So if I give an order, say, shut the door, right? That whether or not people obey my order or even hear it, if I have the authority and fulfill some of the felicity conditions associated with it, I am giving an order. And this order has particular kinds of effects on context just by the fact that it is a specific type of speech act, namely a command or a directive. Likewise, if I ask a question, whether or not anyone answers the question. So likewise with derogatory language, for instance, I want to say that it's expressive of particular kinds of sentiments in a non-accidental sense. So it's not that it just happens to be that the person who is speaking happens to feel the sentiments. And in that way, we can explain that the person might actually not be sincere or might not fully understand the word they're using. So a child can use a slur without being aware that it's really insulting and lack a particular kind of emotion, but they still are doing something that's derogatory and offensive for other people. And then I want to say that we want to capture how it is expressive of hate sentiments, whether or not the targets feel offended, for instance. Right? It is independent, the kind of normative requirement that certain kinds of speech acts are making on context are independent of whether the people in question feel offended, feel targeted, feel hurt, etc. Right? And I think many people want to capture this. Even Waldron wants to capture this. He wants to distinguish between harm and offense. And he says, we're not in the business of making laws about offense. We have to talk about harm in a relevant, more substantive sense.
Teresa, we have, okay. We have a question from Fabian. He has not a microphone right now, but I will read it, okay?
Perfect. Okay.
So Fabian asks, can your expressive approach of hate speech account for and take Leo Strauss' reduction ad Hitlerum seriously?
I have no idea. I had never thought about that. I don't know.
No.
I really don't know. I don't know what to.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. The reduction of Hitler is like everything is like Hitler, and that's very bad, and we shouldn't do that. But I don't know. I would have to think about that. I don't know how to answer the question. And thanks for the question, Fabian.
Okay, we have another one. I don't know if Niklas wants to ask personally. Niklas Kluge Correa asks, Teresa, could you give me your opinion about the difference between the emotions of hate and disgust and how they can affect differently hate speech?
Right. So, it's not my opinion that matters. It's the work of people who work on these emotions that matters. And so I can report what some of the authors that I've mentioned today, what they say in this regard. One of the things that makes the study of hate very difficult, it's because it seems to be a kind of emotion or sentiment that runs at the same time, or that people have at the same time as they have other related negative emotions, which might be disgust, contempt, fear, resentment. And so there tend to be clusters of these emotions in the people who perform hate crime, for instance. Many hate crime events involve, what do they call it? Let me see if I remember. A combination of anger, contempt, and disgust, what is called the Ancodi model, right? And so these tend to occur in collection at the same time as what could be characterized as a hate sentiment, right? If people reach the stage in which they do think they're justified in attacking someone violently because they are angry, they think they're just being angry, they feel contempt in some way for certain kinds of person, and they feel some kind of disgust. This tends to be correlated with really violent actions that lead to killings, because the disgust also helps in people thinking that when people use language like that involves metaphors like cleaning and disinfecting, that is an indication that disgust is involved, right? And so it's also an indication that some violence is coming, right? So they're fairly good predictors of, and they're fairly good. They should be used to monitor hate crime, right? So people should look at how people talk, and some people develop models to monitor and prevent violent events based on this kind of analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I think there are more questions, but I'm really sorry we don't have any more time. So I thank you very much for your talk. It's really very challenging, I think. And we can all ask you for the paper and also maybe for your presentation. And I am very curious about this discussion too. So many are thanking you in the chat here.
Thank you.
I hope you stay with us a little bit more. in the conference, I say, and I hope to see you
in person.
Future, maybe in person.
Yes,
person.
In person. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Very much. Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada, Sofia. Muito obrigada a todos. Foi um prazer.